After my parents passed away, my sister kicked me and my 8-year-old son out of our family home on the very day of the funeral. At the will reading, she mocked me, telling me she made sure I got absolutely nothing and hoped I would enjoy being homeless. But when the lawyer announced my actual net worth and revealed who truly owned the debt on her glamorous lifestyle, my sister fainted right there on the law office floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. The heavy thud of my battered leather suitcase hitting the immaculate front lawn of our family estate in Buckhead is a sound I will never forget. It was the day of my parents' funeral. The repast had barely started. Inside the $4 million house, the air was thick with the comforting smells of fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, and expensive perfume. Dozens of people from our church community were gathered in the living room sharing memories and offering condolences. But out here on the sweeping front porch, the atmosphere was pure poison. My sister Vanessa stood at the top of the brick steps glaring down at me. She was dressed in a custom black designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. Her makeup was perfectly intact, despite the supposedly devastating loss of our parents. She had always been the golden child of the family, the one who could do absolutely no wrong. She married a wealthy wealth manager, lived in high society, and always made sure everyone knew it. I was the opposite. I was the family disappointment, the one who had a child out of wedlock at 24. The one who supposedly leached off our parents' generosity. "This house is mine now, Renee," Vanessa yelled, her voice carrying over the manicured hedges. The chatter inside the house suddenly quieted down as guests began to peek through the large bay windows. "I want you and your little brat off my property in 10 minutes. If you are not gone, I am calling the police and having you escorted off for trespassing." I stood on the grass, feeling the Georgia heat pressing down on my shoulders. Beside me, my 8-year-old son Trey tightened his grip on my hand. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I squeezed his hand back silently, promising him that everything would be okay. I refused to let him see me break. I refused to give Vanessa the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Aunt Loretta was sitting on one of the white wicker chairs on the porch, balancing a plate of peach cobbler on her lap. She had always been the biggest gossip in our church and never missed an opportunity to tear me down. She took a slow bite of her dessert and shook her head in mock pity. "You really need to listen to your sister Renee," Aunt Loretta said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Vanessa and her husband Julian have been taking care of things for a long time. Julian works on Wall Street, for heaven's sake. He has been managing your parents' accounts and making sure they were comfortable. What have you been doing? You have been living here rent-free, eating their food and dragging their good name through the mud with your teenage mistakes. It is time for you to grow up and face the real world." The hypocrisy was staggering. For the past 6 years, I was the one who drove our parents to every doctor appointment. I was the one who managed their daily medications, cooked their meals, and sat with them through long, terrifying nights at the hospital. Vanessa only showed up for holidays to take pictures for her social media. But in the eyes of our extended family, Vanessa was the saint because she had the money and the prestige, while I was just the unemployed single mother taking up space in the guest room. "You have 5 minutes left," Vanessa snapped, checking her gold watch. "Grab your garbage and start walking. Maybe you can find a shelter that takes in failures." The guests inside were now openly staring. Some of the older church ladies whispered behind their hands, shaking their heads at the spectacle. Not a single person stepped out to defend me or ask Vanessa to show some respect on the day we buried our parents. They all sided with the money. They always did. I looked at my suitcase lying in the dirt. It contained a few changes of clothes, my laptop, and some toys for Trey. It was nothing compared to the massive estate looming behind my sister. But I did not care about the house. I cared about the utter lack of respect. I cared about the way they were treating my son, as if he was a burden they could just toss out with the trash. I bent down and picked up the suitcase with my free hand. I stood up straight and locked eyes with Vanessa. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg for extra time or a place to sleep. I just stared at her with a calm, icy resolve that made her falter for a fraction of a second. She expected me to break down and plead for mercy. She wanted me to grovel so she could feel powerful. "Are you deaf?" Vanessa demanded, her voice rising an octave to cover her sudden insecurity. I said, "Get out." "I am leaving, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady and surprisingly loud in the quiet yard. "But remember this moment. Remember how quickly you threw your own blood out onto the street. Because the wheel always turns and you have no idea what is coming for you." Aunt Loretta scoffed loudly. "Lord have mercy, she is trying to put a hex on you, Vanessa. Just ignore her. She is just bitter because she has nothing and you have everything." I gave Aunt Loretta a slow, deliberate smile. "Enjoy that peach cobbler, Aunt Loretta. It might be the last sweet thing you taste in this house for a very long time." I turned my back on them. I did not look at the house or the people watching from the windows. I kept my head held high and walked down the long paved driveway with my son by my side. Every step took me further away from the toxicity I had endured for decades. They thought they were punishing me by casting me out into the world with nothing. They thought I was a helpless single mother who would inevitably fail without their charity. They were so completely wrong. What none of them knew, not Vanessa, not Aunt Loretta, and certainly not Vanessa's arrogant husband Julian, was that my entire life had been a carefully constructed facade. I was not unemployed. I was not broke. And I was definitely not helpless. They thought they held all the cards because they had appearances on their side. But I held the one thing that actually mattered. I held the truth. And very soon the truth was going to destroy every single lie they had built their perfect little lives upon. The heavy wooden front door creaked open behind Vanessa, and heavy footsteps echoed on the porch. Out stepped Julian, my wonderful brother-in-law. Julian was a tall white man who carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. He was wearing a custom navy blue suit that clung to his frame, and his hair was slicked back in a way that screamed Wall Street wannabe. Ever since he married Vanessa, he had positioned himself as the great white savior of our family. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on because he was a wealth manager, and to them that meant he had class and intelligence. They completely ignored his subtle jabs and the way he talked down to everyone in the room. Julian slid his hands into his tailored pockets and looked down at me with a smirk that made my stomach churn. He always looked at me like I was a charity case, a stain on his perfect family portrait. He walked down the brick steps, taking his time making sure everyone was watching his grand entrance. He stopped right in front of Trey. My son shrank back slightly, but I squeezed his hand to keep him steady. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $100 bill. He held it out to Trey like he was feeding a stray dog. "Here, buddy, go buy yourself some candy," Julian said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Your mom probably does not have enough gas money to get that rusted Honda out of our neighborhood." The ladies on the porch murmured in agreement, completely blind to the blatant disrespect. Julian puffed out his chest, looking around to soak in the admiration of his audience. He turned his attention back to me, his blue eyes cold and mocking. "You know, Renee, it is a shame you never learned the value of $1. He continued, shaking his head slowly. "You people always wait around for handouts instead of putting in the work. Vanessa and I work hard for what we have. We built our wealth. You just sit around waiting for someone to bail you out of your mistakes. It is embarrassing, really." My blood boiled, but my face remained completely still. "You people." That was his favorite phrase. He used it all the time, wrapping his prejudice in financial advice, so my parents would not call him out on it. I looked at the crumpled $100 bill in his outstretched hand. He expected me to slap it away or start screaming so he could play the victim. He wanted me to act like the angry black woman he always claimed I was. Instead, I reached out and calmly snatched the bill from his fingers. His smug smile faltered for a second, confused by my compliance. I smoothed out the wrinkled bill, folding it neatly and sliding it into my purse. I looked up at him and gave him the most chilling smile I could muster. "Thank you, Julian," I said softly, making sure my voice carried just enough for him and Vanessa to hear. "I really appreciate the generosity." I just hope this $100 is not from the First Zion Church pension fund you have been mismanaging for the last 6 months. The air around us seemed to freeze. Julian's smug smile completely vanished, falling right off his perfectly shaved face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost standing in the afternoon sun. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Vanessa snapped her head toward him, confusion replacing her haughty glare. "What did you just say?" Vanessa hissed, stepping forward. I kept my eyes locked on Julian, watching the sheer terror bloom in his pupils. He knew exactly what I was talking about. He knew I knew. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly tracking the financial movements of his supposed wealth management firm. He had been secretly siphoning money from the retirement accounts of the elderly church members to cover his massive gambling debts and bad investments. He thought he was untouchable. He thought nobody in our community had the financial literacy to catch him. "You heard me," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "Better check your ledgers, Julian. The math is not mathing, and you are running out of time to fix it." I turned away from them before he could recover enough to form a lie. I took Trey by the hand and we walked down the rest of the driveway. Behind me, the silence on the porch was deafening. The murmurs had stopped. The arrogant chuckles were gone. There was only the sound of my sensible shoes hitting the pavement. We reached my beat-up Honda Civic parked on the street just outside their pristine property line. The paint was chipping, and the bumper had a dent in it from a hit-and-run 3 years ago. It was the ultimate symbol of my supposed failure. I opened the passenger door for Trey and made sure he was buckled in tight. He looked at me with a small, tentative smile. "Are we going to be homeless, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling just a little. I leaned in and kissed his forehead. "Not a chance, baby," I whispered. "We are just moving on to better things." I closed his door and walked around to the driver's side. I slid into the worn fabric seat and put the key in the ignition. The old engine sputtered for a second before roaring to life. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Julian was still standing on the grass staring at my car like he had just seen the Grim Reaper. Vanessa was grabbing his arm, demanding answers that he was clearly too terrified to give. Aunt Loretta had stopped eating her peach cobbler entirely. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the sprawling estate and all its toxic inhabitants in my rearview mirror. As I drove down the winding, tree-lined streets of the wealthy neighborhood, I let out a long breath. The air conditioning in the old Honda was barely working, but I did not care. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. My parents were gone, and with them went the last threads of obligation I had to that house and those people. Vanessa and Julian thought they had just discarded a heavy burden, but they had actually just unleashed their worst nightmare. I glanced over at Trey, who was looking out the window watching the massive mansions roll by. He did not know that his mother was not the struggling outcast everyone said she was. He did not know that the woman driving this busted car was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most ruthless private equity firms in the state. I had built my empire entirely in the shadows. When my family cast me out at 24 pregnant and scared, I did not crumble. I used my natural brilliance for numbers to claw my way to the very top of the financial world. I bought distressed debt and turned it into massive profits. I hid my identity behind layers of corporate shell companies because I knew if my family ever found out, they would try to claim my success as their own. Now that they had officially thrown me out and drawn the battle lines, I no longer had to hide. Julian was a predator who preyed on our community, and my sister was a willing accomplice blinded by designer labels and country club memberships. They thought they were the apex predators, but they were swimming in a tank with a shark they could not even see. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my mind already racing with the calculations of my next move. The drive from the sprawling lawns of Buckhead to the towering glass and steel of Midtown Atlanta took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into an entirely different universe. I navigated my dented Honda Civic through the heavy afternoon traffic, ignoring the strange looks from drivers in luxury sedans. They probably thought I was a housekeeper heading home from a shift. Let them think whatever they wanted. Underestimation was the greatest advantage I had ever been given. I turned off the main avenue and pulled up to the discreet black gates of the Paramount Tower. It was one of the most exclusive high-rise residential buildings in the city, where professional athletes and tech billionaires bought their privacy. I rolled down my window and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner hidden beneath a sleek metal panel. The heavy iron gate swung open instantly, and I drove down into the brightly lit underground parking garage. I parked my beat-up Civic right between a matte black Lamborghini and a pristine white Range Rover. Trey unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his small backpack, looking around the cavernous garage with wide eyes. We walked toward the private elevator reserved exclusively for the penthouse residents. The polished marble floor echoed with our footsteps. I pressed the call button and the brushed steel doors slid open silently. We stepped inside and the elevator began its rapid ascent toward the sky. The walls were mirrored and I caught a glimpse of us standing there. A mother in a simple dress and a little boy holding a worn backpack about to claim their true place in the world. Trey looked up at me, his small brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, why is Aunt Vanessa so mean to us?" he asked, his voice soft over the low hum of the elevator. "Why did she make us leave our house?" I knelt down, so I was right at his eye level. I brushed a stray curl from his forehead, taking a deep breath before answering. "She is not just mean, baby," I explained, keeping my voice steady and reassuring. "Your Aunt Vanessa grew up believing that the only way she could be special was if someone else was less than her. Grandma and Grandpa always gave her everything. Whenever she made a mistake, they called it an accident and bought her a new toy. But if I ever made a mistake, it was a disaster. They needed a perfect golden child, and they needed someone to blame when things went wrong. They chose her to be the princess, and they chose me to be the scapegoat." Trey tilted his head, still trying to process the adult cruelty of it all. "But that is not fair, Mom." I smiled and kissed his cheek as the elevator dinged softly, signaling our arrival. "No, it is not fair," I agreed, standing back up. "But the world does not care about fair, Trey. It only cares about leverage, and today we just got all of it." The elevator doors opened directly into the foyer of our actual home. It was a $5 million penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the massive living space, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the custom white oak floors, the imported Italian leather furniture, and the massive marble kitchen island. There was no clutter here, no suffocating memories, no judging eyes. It was pure, unadulterated peace. Trey immediately dropped his backpack and ran over to the massive glass windows, pressing his hands against the pane as he looked down at the tiny cars crawling along the streets far below. "Wow, Mom, look how high up we are!" He cheered, his earlier sadness completely forgotten. I smiled, watching him trace the outline of the skyscrapers. He was safe here. He was protected. Now it was time for me to go to work. I walked over to the kitchen island and pressed a concealed button underneath the marble overhang. A seamless drawer slid out, revealing my secure workstation. I pulled out my matte black laptop and flipped it open. The screen flared to life, demanding a retinal scan and a complex sequence of passwords. Within seconds, I was logged into the encrypted internal servers of Apex Holdings. This was my empire. I had built Apex from the ground up, turning it into one of the most aggressive and successful private equity firms in the Southeast. We specialized in acquiring distressed debt, corporate takeovers, and liquidating toxic assets. My name was nowhere on the public documents. On paper, the company was managed by a board of directors, but in reality, I pulled every single string from the shadows. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my executive assistant, Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "Good afternoon, boss," Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional. "I trust the funeral arrangements went as smoothly as could be expected." "The funeral was fine, Marcus," I replied, staring out at the fading sunset. "The aftermath, however, was quite enlightening. I need you to drop whatever you are working on right now and initiate a full-spectrum financial sweep." "Of course," Marcus said, and I could hear his fingers already flying across a keyboard. "Who is the target?" "Julian Pierce," I said, saying my brother-in-law's name like it was a disease. "I want every single financial record attached to his wealth management firm. I want his personal credit history, his corporate tax filings, and every hidden shell company he has registered in the state of Georgia or anywhere else. I want to know where he buys his coffee and who he owes money to. Specifically, I want his complete debt portfolio on my desk in 1 hour. Marcus did not even pause. Consider it done. We already have some preliminary flags on his firm from a sector scan we did last quarter. It looked like he was heavily overleveraged in some bad commercial real estate deals. I felt a cold smile stretch across my face. Overleverage does not even begin to cover it, Marcus. He has been stealing from a church pension fund to cover his margins, and I am willing to bet my entire portfolio that he is drowning in toxic debt. Find whoever holds the largest percentage of his outstanding loans. I do not care what the premium is. Buy it. I want Apex Holdings to be his sole creditor by the end of the week. Understood, boss, Marcus replied perfectly, matching my ruthless energy. I will have the dossier securely transmitted to your terminal in 60 minutes. We will own his debt before he even wakes up tomorrow. I ended the call and set the phone down on the cold marble counter. I looked back over at my son, who was now happily playing with a set of toy cars on the expensive rug. Vanessa and Julian thought they had completely ruined my life this afternoon. They thought they had sent me packing into the unforgiving streets with nothing but a suitcase and a crying child. They believed their own lies so deeply that they never bothered to look beneath the surface. I opened a secure financial modeling program on my screen and started preparing the acquisition frameworks. Julian wanted to talk about people needing handouts. He wanted to parade his unearned wealth and demean me in front of my own family. Soon he would learn exactly what it meant to have absolutely nothing. He was going to find out what it felt like to be entirely at the mercy of someone who despised him. The wheel was already turning, and I was the one controlling the spin. 3 days later, the morning sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office. I was sitting at my custom marble desk, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that cost more than Vanessa's entire fake designer wardrobe. Marcus stood across from me, holding a thick leather binder containing the final legal documents for the acquisition of Julian's debt portfolio. It had taken our legal team exactly 72 hours to corner the market on his toxic loans. We now owned every single financial mistake he had made over the past 5 years. Just as Marcus handed me the heavy gold pen to sign the final authorization, my personal cell phone began to buzz on the desk. I glanced down at the screen and saw Vanessa's name flashing. I held up a finger to Marcus, signaling him to wait. I cleared my throat, adjusting my posture, and pressed the answer button, putting the call on speakerphone so Marcus could hear the sheer audacity of my sister. "Hello," I said, making my voice sound small and exhausted, like a woman who had not slept in days. "Well, well, well, if it is not the homeless single mother," Vanessa crooned, her voice dripping with venomous glee. "How is the motel living, Renee? Are the bedbugs treating you well?" I kept my face completely blank as I looked up at my stunning skyline view. "What do you want, Vanessa?" I asked, my tone defeated. "I just called to give you a little financial update," she said, letting out a sharp, cruel laugh. "You see, before Mom and Dad passed away, they gave me full medical power of attorney to handle their affairs. And as their trusted representative, I realized there was a loose end that needed tying up. I just got off the phone with the bank, and I officially froze that joint checking account you shared with them." I raised an eyebrow at Marcus, who looked equally amused and disgusted. The account Vanessa was talking about was a basic checking account my parents had set up years ago to help me buy groceries when I was first struggling with Trey. It currently had a grand total of $512 in it. To Vanessa, this was a massive victory. She thought she was cutting off my life support. "Vanessa, you cannot do that!" I said, injecting a perfect note of panic into my voice. "I need that money. Trey's school tuition is due next week, and I do not have anything else. Please do not do this to him." Hearing my supposed desperation was like oxygen to her. She let out a dramatic sigh that echoed through the phone speaker. "Oh, Renee, you really should have thought about Trey's tuition before you decided to be so disrespectful to me and Julian on the porch. You bit the hand that fed you, and now you are going to starve. I know you needed that money, you broke loser, but that is what happens when you act like you are better than us. Maybe you can go clean houses to pay for his school. Or better yet, Maybe you should just pull him out and put him in a public school where people like you belong. I reached out and took the gold pen from Marcus. I positioned the tip of the pen over the signature line of the Apex Holdings acquisition contract, the document that officially made me the sole owner of Julian's $3.5 million debt. Please, Vanessa, I begged, forcing my breathing to become ragged as if I was on the verge of tears. Just let me have the $500. It is for your nephew. Do not punish him because you hate me. He is not my responsibility. She snapped, her voice turning cold and vicious. And frankly, I am sick of subsidizing your mistakes. The account is frozen, and it is going to stay frozen until it gets absorbed into the estate which Julian and I are inheriting. You get nothing, Renee. Absolutely nothing. Do not ever call me again. She hung up the phone with a loud click. The line went dead, leaving a heavy silence in the spacious office. Marcus stared at the phone, and then looked up at me, shaking his head in disbelief. I let out a long, calm breath and completely dropped the frantic victim persona. I looked down at the contract on my desk, pressed the gold pen to the paper, and signed my name with smooth, elegant strokes. With that single signature, I just authorized a $3.5 million transfer. I slid the signed contract across the marble desk back to Marcus. Process it immediately, I told him, my voice back to its normal commanding tone. I want Julian's lenders paid off by noon. I want the deed to his commercial properties held in escrow under our holding company, and I want the foreclosure notices drafted and ready for my approval. Marcus closed the leather binder with a satisfying thud. Right away, boss, he said, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I must say your sister drives a very hard bargain over $500. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and swiveled slightly to look out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. She thinks she just won a war by stealing my lunch money, I murmured, shaking my head at the sheer smallness of her ambition. She is so obsessed with keeping me at the bottom that she cannot even comprehend the game being played above her head. It was pathetic, really. Vanessa had weaponized a medical power of attorney designed to help our dying parents just to steal a measly $500 from her own nephew. She thought that money was my survival fund. She thought I was sitting in a rundown motel crying over tuition fees. In reality, Trey was in the next room working with a private tutor that cost more per hour than Vanessa spent on her weekly manicures. They were entirely blinded by their own arrogance. Julian thought his financial crimes were invisible because he wore a nice suit and spoke with unearned authority. Vanessa thought she was powerful because she married him and bullied her younger sister. They were building a castle on a foundation of sand, and they had just handed me the remote detonator. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt. The timeline was accelerating. If Vanessa was already freezing minor accounts, it meant she and Julian were getting desperate for liquid cash. Julian's creditors must be breathing down his neck, threatening to expose his fraud. He was pushing Vanessa to consolidate the family assets as quickly as possible so he could drain them. Let them rush, I thought to myself, walking toward the massive windows. Let them think they have backed me into a corner. When you make your enemy believe they are invincible, they stop checking their blind spots. I pulled out my secure phone and checked my calendar. Vanessa was hosting her extravagant family barbecue this weekend to celebrate her supposed inheritance. It would be the perfect stage. She wanted an audience to witness my downfall. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted, but the script was going to be entirely mine. Sunday morning arrived with the thick, humid air that Atlanta was famous for. I woke up early and dressed Trey in a neat pair of slacks and a crisp button-down shirt. For myself, I bypassed the expensive tailored suits hidden in the back of my custom closet and pulled out a faded floral dress that I had owned for nearly a decade. It was simple, cheap, and slightly frayed at the hem. It was the absolute perfect costume for the role my family was so desperately trying to force me into. We drove to First Zion Church, arriving just early enough to take our seats before the main congregation poured through the doors. First Zion was not just a place of worship, it was the social epicenter for the wealthy and connected families in our community. The sanctuary was massive, featuring towering stained glass windows, polished mahogany pews that gleamed under warm overhead lighting, and a choir loft that looked like it belonged in a concert hall. Everyone who was anyone in the local black upper middle class attended this church. It was a place where social status was measured by the size of your donation check and the designer label on your Sunday hat. I slid into the second row right behind the family pew where my parents used to sit every single week. Trey sat quietly next to me, swinging his short legs as the choir began their opening hymns. The music was beautiful and uplifting, filling the massive room with a joyful noise. But the atmosphere in the sanctuary completely shifted the moment the heavy double doors at the back of the church swung open. It was Vanessa and Julian. They were perfectly on brand, deliberately arriving 15 minutes late to ensure that every single eye in the building was locked on them as they made their grand entrance. Vanessa was wearing a blindingly white custom suit with an oversized designer hat that practically required its own zip code. She clung tightly to Julian's arm, acting as if she were walking down a Hollywood red carpet instead of a church aisle. Julian wore a tailored light gray suit, his chest puffed out with that same unearned arrogance he carried everywhere he went. They paraded down the center aisle, taking their sweet time to soak in the admiring glances from the congregation. When they reached the front row, Aunt Loretta and Uncle Vernon were already sitting there, saving the best spots for them. Vanessa paused before entering the pew, turning her attention to Brother Davis, the elderly head usher who was standing nearby holding a stack of silver collection plates. Vanessa did not bother to lower her voice. In fact, she seemed to project it on purpose, letting her sharp words carry clearly over the soft background hum of the choir behind the altar. "Brother Davis," she said, waving her freshly manicured hand in a dismissive gesture. "I need you to do the Church Finance Committee a favor and officially remove my sister Renee from the building fund and the weekly donation registry." Brother Davis looked visibly taken aback. He glanced uncomfortably over Vanessa's shoulder to where I was sitting just one row behind them. "Are you absolutely sure, Vanessa?" he asked nervously, shifting his weight. "Sister Renee has been a faithful contributor to this ministry for many years." Vanessa let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that echoed in the quiet space between the pews. "Oh, that was in the past, Brother Davis," she declared. "Unfortunately, Renee has fallen on extremely hard times. She was evicted from our family home just a few days ago and is completely destitute. It is a very sad situation, but she is practically homeless right now. We cannot in good conscience allow the church to expect tithes from someone who cannot even afford to feed her own child or keep a roof over her head." The people sitting in the surrounding pews gasped softly. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the congregation. Church fans fluttered much faster as the juicy gossip reached the middle rows. I sat perfectly still, keeping my face a mask of absolute calm, while my sister publicly humiliated me in front of the entire community. Aunt Loretta turned around in her seat, shaking her head slowly with a look of entirely fake pity plastered across her face. "Bless her heart," Aunt Loretta muttered loudly enough for the people behind us to hear. "We prayed for her, but some people just refuse to get their lives right with the Lord." Uncle Vernon simply chuckled under his breath, fixing his expensive tie and looking at me with undisguised contempt. Julian decided he needed to add his own intellectual spin to my public execution. He leaned over the back of the front pew, resting his arms on the polished wood, and looked down at me with a sickening smirk. "It really is a tragedy," Julian said, his voice carrying the smug tone of a man giving a financial seminar to peasants. "This is exactly what a lack of basic financial literacy does to a person. You make bad investments in your youth, you refuse to build a proper credit history, and eventually the real world catches up to you. The church should focus its resources on members who actually contribute to the economy, instead of those just waiting around for a handout." He smiled at me, expecting me to shrink down in my seat in total shame. He expected me to cry or grab my son and run out the back doors in embarrassment. Vanessa turned around to look at me as well, her eyes glittering with malicious triumph. She had finally done it. She had completely stripped away my dignity in front of the only community that had ever mattered to our parents. She had painted me as the ultimate failure, the pathetic scapegoat who was relying on the charity of others just to survive the week. The choir finished their hymn, and the sanctuary grew completely quiet, waiting for the pastor to take the podium. The sudden silence made the tension in our section of the pews feel incredibly suffocating. Dozens of judgmental eyes were locked on me, waiting for my reaction. They wanted a show. They wanted a breakdown. I slowly took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I did not look away from Julian's mocking blue eyes. I calmly placed my Bible down on the wooden seat next to me. I stood up tall, straight as an arrow, and smoothed the front of my cheap faded dress with absolute precision. I did not rush a single movement. I did not show a single ounce of fear, anger, or shame. I reached down and gently took Trey's hand, helping him step out into the carpeted aisle. I kept my posture perfect, and my chin raised high as I stepped out of the pew. I walked directly past Uncle Vernon and Aunt Loretta. I walked directly past the gaping mouth of Brother Davis. I did not say a single word of defense. I did not need to defend myself against their desperate, fragile lies. The sheer, undeniable calm radiating from me seemed to unsettle them more than any screaming match ever could. I stepped right up to the edge of their pew, moving with the silent grace of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. I paused right beside Julian. He leaned back against the polished wood of the pew, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. He honestly thought I was about to beg for forgiveness or break down crying right there in the aisle. He tilted his head, offering me a patronizing look, waiting for the pathetic apology he believed he was owed. Instead, I slowly leaned down. I placed my hand on the back of the pew for balance and brought my face just inches from his ear. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne completely masked the smell of the church lilies, but it could not hide the sudden nervous hitch in his breathing when I got too close. I kept my voice incredibly low. I made sure it was nothing more than a lethal whisper designed entirely for him. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is auditing your offshore shell accounts on Tuesday," I murmured, letting every single word land with the precision of a surgical blade. "Better start shredding fast, Julian. Because the federal government does not care about your country club memberships, and they definitely do not care about your pretty white privilege. They only care about the math, and your math is about to send you to federal prison." I pulled back slowly and stood up straight. The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous and absolutely glorious to witness. The smug, condescending smile completely shattered. It wiped away so fast, it was as if he had seen a ghost standing right in front of him. All the color drained from his artificially tanned face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His jaw went completely slack, and his eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered terror. The heavy leather-bound Bible he had been holding loosely in his right hand suddenly slipped right through his fingers. It plummeted to the floor, hitting the solid oak planks with a loud, heavy thud. In the quiet anticipation of the sanctuary waiting for the pastor to speak, the sound echoed like a gunshot. Dozens of heads immediately turned toward our pew. The pastor, who was just stepping up to the podium, paused and looked over his glasses at the commotion. Vanessa snapped her head down to look at the dropped Bible and then stared at her husband. Her perfect, carefully crafted public facade slipped into an expression of genuine confusion and embarrassment. "Julian, what is wrong with you?" Vanessa hissed through her perfectly whitened teeth. She reached out and grabbed his forearm, her nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Pick that up right now, people are staring at us." But Julian did not bend down to pick up the holy book. He remained completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the back of the pew in front of him. A thick bead of sweat formed at his hairline and rolled slowly down the side of his face, completely ruining his immaculate grooming. His chest began to heave as his breathing turned shallow and erratic. He was having a silent panic attack right in the middle of First Zion Church. When Vanessa tugged on his arm a second time, demanding that he compose himself, the unthinkable happened. Julian violently yanked his arm away from her grip. "Shut up, Vanessa!" he snapped loudly. His voice cracked with sheer panic, and it was entirely too loud for the quiet sanctuary. "Just shut your mouth for once in your pathetic life." The entire front section of the church collectively gasped. Vanessa recoiled as if she had just been slapped across the face. Her jaw dropped, and her eyes welled up with immediate, humiliated tears. It was the very first time anyone in this community had ever seen the perfect golden couple show a single crack in their flawless armor. Julian, the man who constantly preached about family values and respect, had just publicly humiliated the golden child in front of all her admiring friends. Aunt Loretta clutched her chest in shock, entirely forgetting about her own performance. Uncle Vernon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking anywhere but at the disaster unfolding beside him. The pristine image my sister had spent years building was currently crumbling into dust right before her eyes. I did not stay to watch the rest of the fallout. I had delivered the message, and the poison was already working its way through his system. I simply adjusted my grip on Trey's small hand and turned my back on the chaos. I walked peacefully up the center aisle, heading straight for the heavy double doors at the back of the sanctuary. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who owned the ground she stepped on. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright morning sunshine of Atlanta. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the church vanished instantly, replaced by the warm, fresh breeze. I walked Trey toward our beat-up car, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in over a decade. The dominoes were finally falling. Vanessa and Julian were supposed to be celebrating their victory over me today, but instead they were sitting in a pew rotting from the inside out. Julian knew his days were numbered, and the stress of that secret was going to tear his marriage apart long before the federal agents even knocked on his door. And the best part was that he had absolutely no idea that the very same woman he had just mocked for needing handouts was the exact person pulling the strings of his destruction. I opened the car door for Trey and smiled. Our weekend was just getting started, and the main event was still to come. Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour that washed the streets of Atlanta clean. But inside the climate-controlled sanctuary of Apex Holdings, the atmosphere was electric. I stepped out of the private elevator and walked across the expansive trading floor where dozens of analysts were quietly destroying and rebuilding corporate portfolios. None of them looked up as I passed. They were trained to be ruthless and efficient, just like the woman who signed their massive bonus checks. I walked directly into my corner office and found Marcus waiting for me standing by the massive mahogany conference table. Spread out across the polished wood was a sea of financial documents, bank statements, and property deeds. Marcus did not smile this time. His usual sharp demeanor was replaced by a look of profound disgust. "We found the bottom, boss," Marcus said, pushing a thick red folder toward the center of the table. "Julian is not just drowning, he is already at the bottom of the ocean, and he is trying to drag your family estate down with him." I walked over and opened the heavy red folder. The first page was a comprehensive summary of Julian's total liabilities. The number staring back at me was staggering: $3.5 million in unsecured corporate debt and massive margin calls. He had leveraged his boutique wealth management firm to the absolute limit, making incredibly reckless bets on commercial real estate projects that had completely stalled out during the latest economic downturn. When those investments tanked, he panicked. Instead of declaring bankruptcy and taking the hit like a real businessman, he started skimming from his own clients. He drained the church pension fund just to keep the lights on and pay the minimum interest on his toxic loans. But that was not even the worst part. I flipped to the second section of the dossier and felt the breath catch in my throat. My hands began to shake slightly as I stared at a high-resolution copy of a commercial mortgage agreement. He needed collateral to secure a final bridge loan. Marcus explained, his voice quiet but filled with anger. His own credit was completely shot, so he went looking for an unencumbered asset. He found the Buckhead estate. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the contract. It was my father's handwriting, but it was completely wrong. The letters were shaky and uneven, trailing off at the end of his name. My father had always possessed impeccable penmanship, a source of great pride for him. This signature belonged to a man who barely knew what day it was. I looked at the date on the notary stamp. It was signed exactly 3 weeks before my father passed away. He was on a massive dose of morphine during that entire week, I whispered, tracing the jagged lines of my father's forged consent. I was the one administering his medication. He was sleeping 20 hours a day and hallucinating when he was awake. There is absolutely no way he understood what he was signing. Julian must have slipped this document into a stack of routine medical release forms. He tricked a dying man into mortgaging a $4 million family legacy just to save his own pathetic skin. The sheer depravity of it made my blood run cold. Vanessa had kicked me and my son out of that house, claiming it was her rightful inheritance. She strutted around like the Queen of Buckhead, totally oblivious to the fact that her husband had secretly sold the castle out from under her. Or maybe she did know, and she was just as guilty as he was. Either way, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had weaponized my father's final moments of vulnerability. "So what is the current status of this loan?" I asked, looking up at Marcus with a singular, terrifying focus. "The original lender was getting ready to foreclose," Marcus replied, tapping a separate stack of papers. "Julian has been dodging their calls for a month. He filed an emergency request for a 90-day extension last Friday, begging for time to liquidate some assets." I closed the red folder and placed my hands flat on the table. "Did we acquire the paper?" Marcus finally smiled, a cold, calculating expression that perfectly mirrored my own. "The wire transfer cleared an hour ago. Apex Holdings now owns the entirety of Julian's debt portfolio. We bought it at a massive premium, but we secured every single note. You are now his sole creditor. His extension request is currently sitting in your inbox waiting for an answer." "Deny the extension," I said without a single second of hesitation. "Reject it immediately, and begin drafting the foreclosure notices for the Buckhead estate. I want the legal paperwork ironclad, so when the hammer falls, there is absolutely no room for him to maneuver." Marcus nodded, taking notes on his tablet. "It will be done before lunch." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the rain-slicked city. Julian thought he had completely outsmarted everyone. He thought he could steal from the elderly, rob his own family, and walk away completely unscathed, while Vanessa played the role of the grieving, wealthy daughter. They were planning to host a massive family barbecue this coming Saturday at the estate to celebrate their triumph. Vanessa had sent me a mocking text message just that morning, telling me I was allowed to attend only if I agreed to work the grill and serve the guests. She promised she would give me back my mother's vintage pearl necklace as payment if I did a good enough job flipping burgers for her friends. She wanted to humiliate me one last time in front of the entire extended family. She wanted to break my spirit completely. I smiled, staring at my own reflection in the wet glass. I was going to attend that barbecue. I was going to put on my cheap clothes and walk into the lion's den, playing the perfect part of the broken sister. I was going to let them drink their expensive wine and laugh their arrogant laughs. I would let them climb all the way to the very top of their imaginary pedestal, because the higher they climbed, the harder the impact would be when I finally shattered the ground beneath their feet. The financial trap was now fully set, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. Julian was currently living on borrowed time, unaware that the executioner was already in the room. I spent the rest of the afternoon going over the legal statutes with my corporate attorneys, ensuring that there was no bankruptcy loophole he could exploit. We locked down every single avenue of escape. When he fell, he was going to fall hard, and he was going to take Vanessa right down with him into the dirt where they belonged. I packed up my briefcase and headed back to the penthouse to spend the evening with Trey, knowing that our lives were about to change forever. The barbecue was only a few days away, and the menu was going to feature nothing but pure, unadulterated justice. Saturday arrived with a blistering heat that baked the sprawling lawns of the Buckhead estate, but that did not stop Vanessa from throwing the most extravagant barbecue our family had ever seen. Cars lined the street for blocks, and the backyard was filled with catered tents, expensive floral arrangements, and a live jazz band playing softly near the swimming pool. It was a massive celebration of wealth that did not belong to her. I walked through the side gate wearing a plain cotton t-shirt and faded jeans, completely blending in with the catering staff. I had left Trey back at the penthouse with his tutor, refusing to subject my son to another afternoon of their toxic behavior. Vanessa spotted me immediately and marched over holding a cold glass of champagne in one hand and my mother's vintage pearl necklace dangling carelessly from the other. She wore a flowing silk sundress and oversized designer sunglasses, acting like the lady of the manor. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with malice behind the dark lenses as she held the pearls just out of my reach. "If you want these back, you are going to have to earn them," she said, pointing toward the massive custom grill smoking at the edge of the patio. "The caterers are too slow, and I want the ribs done my way." "Get to work, Renee. Try not to burn anything this time." I looked at the delicate pearls swaying from her manicured fingers. They were the last piece of my mother I had left, and Vanessa was using them as a leash to humiliate me in front of her high society friends. I did not argue. I simply nodded, tied a stained apron around my waist, and walked over to the blistering heat of the grill. I grabbed the metal tongs and started flipping the expensive cuts of meat, playing the part of the obedient broken sister. The smoke stung my eyes and the heat radiated against my skin, but I focused on the satisfying sizzle of the fat hitting the coals. Every drop of sweat was just another deposit into the bank of my incoming revenge. It did not take long for Aunt Loretta to make her way over to my station. She was wearing a bright yellow sundress and balancing a plate piled high with potato salad and baked beans. She leaned over the grill, waving a hand in front of her face, as if my very presence offended her. "These ribs look entirely too dry." "Renee," Aunt Loretta complained, shaking her head in loud disapproval. "Vanessa pays good money for this meat, and you are ruining it just like you ruin everything else in your life. I swear if Julian and Vanessa were not so generous, you would not even be allowed on this side of town. You should be on your knees thanking them for letting you touch their food." I flipped a rack of ribs, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "You are absolutely right, Aunt Loretta," I replied, my voice completely flat. "Julian is a very generous man. I am sure he is taking excellent care of all of you." She huffed and waddled away to complain to the church ladies about my supposed lack of culinary skills. I watched her go, feeling a deep sense of pity for her profound ignorance. But my attention was quickly drawn to the outdoor bar situated just a few feet away from my grill station. Uncle Vernon was leaning heavily against the marble counter, swirling a glass of very expensive amber bourbon. His face was flushed and his tie was loosened. He was already dangerously intoxicated. Julian walked up to the bar, checking his designer watch with a tight, anxious expression on his face. The whisper I had dropped in his ear at church was clearly still eating away at his nerves. He ordered a simple club soda, but Uncle Vernon clamped a heavy hand down on Julian's shoulder, nearly spilling his own bourbon in the process. "Cheer up, Julian," Uncle Vernon slurred, laughing loudly. "You look like you are going to a funeral instead of a party." "We pulled it off, boy. We actually did it." Julian stiffened and looked around nervously. "Keep your voice down, Vernon," he hissed, trying to pry the older man's sweaty hand off his expensive suit jacket. "There are people everywhere." Uncle Vernon just laughed louder, completely ignoring the warning. "Oh, let them hear," he boasted, taking a large gulp of his drink. "They all think you are a financial genius, but I know the real secret. I still cannot believe you actually got the old man to sign that commercial mortgage paper while he was completely out of his mind on painkillers. I told you it would work. I kept Vanessa and Loretta distracted in the kitchen while you slipped the paperwork right under his nose." My hand froze on the metal tongs. The sizzling of the meat faded into the background as a cold, heavy realization settled over me. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. "You promised me 10% of the cash out." Julian Uncle Vernon continued, his voice turning slightly aggressive as the alcohol fueled his greed. "Do not think I forgot about my cut. You used my distraction to steal this $4 million house, and I expect my wire transfer by Monday morning, or I am going to have a very loud conversation with the authorities." Julian grabbed Uncle Vernon's arm and dragged him away from the bar, hissing furious threats about keeping his mouth shut, but it was already too late. I had heard every single word. I stood frozen, staring at the burning coals as the final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. It was not just Julian and Vanessa. It was Uncle Vernon, too. And if Vernon knew, it was highly likely that Aunt Loretta was in on it as well. My entire extended family had conspired to defraud my dying father. They had sat in his house, eaten his food, and plotted to steal his legacy while he lay heavily medicated in the very next room. They had actively helped Julian commit federal mortgage fraud just so they could get a pathetic 10% kickback. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever thought possible. I had spent the last 24 hours focused on destroying Julian and Vanessa. But now the target had drastically expanded. They had all sold their souls for a few pieces of silver. They thought they were a brilliant criminal syndicate, pulling off the perfect heist against a dying man and his supposedly clueless daughter. I gripped the metal tongs so hard my knuckles turned white. The smoke from the grill wrapped around me, hiding the dangerous smile that was slowly spreading across my face. They wanted me to serve them. They wanted me to cook their food and listen to their insults while they celebrated stealing my family home. I was going to let them enjoy this barbecue. I was going to let them eat, drink, and be merry. Because when Monday morning rolled around, none of them were going to have a dime to their names. The complete and total destruction of my family had just become my absolute top priority. I dropped the heavy metal tongs right onto the concrete patio. The loud clatter cut through the soft jazz music playing in the background, causing several guests to turn their heads in our direction. I untied the stained apron from my waist and let it fall right there on the ground, stepping over it as I walked away from the smoking grill. The blistering heat of the fire was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, pure rage currently coursing through my veins. I did not care about the ribs. I did not care about the caterers staring at me in confusion. I marched straight toward the edge of the sparkling blue swimming pool where Vanessa and Julian were standing. Vanessa saw me approaching, and her fake hostess smile instantly hardened into a vicious sneer. She quickly excused herself from a group of her wealthy friends and stepped directly into my path, trying to block my way to Julian. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so her country club friends would not hear her losing her temper. "Get back to the grill, Renee. You are embarrassing me in front of the entire neighborhood, and if you ruin this meat, you are never getting those pearls back. I am done cooking for thieves." "Vanessa," I said, my voice calm but loud enough for the people standing nearby to catch. The jazz band seemed to sense the sudden tension, and the music slowly faded out, leaving an incredibly uncomfortable silence over the lavish backyard. People were stopping their conversations, whispering and pointing their expensive champagne glasses in our direction. I looked right past my sister to where Julian was standing by the outdoor bar. His face was pale and tight. "I heard everything, Julian," I called out to him, making sure my voice carried across the patio. "I heard what Vernon just said about the mortgage papers and the painkillers. I know exactly what you did to my father while he was dying." Vanessa's eyes darted nervously around the patio, but she quickly recovered, slapping on a look of exaggerated pity. She turned to the guests who were now openly staring at our family drama. "Please forgive my sister, Vanessa," announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear her theatrical performance. "She has always been a jealous liar. She cannot handle the fact that our parents left this beautiful estate to me and Julian because she is a complete failure in life. She is just trying to cause a scene to get attention because she is broke and desperate. Do not listen to a word she says. She is completely unstable." Julian decided this was his moment to take control of the situation. He handed his glass of club soda to a passing waiter and took a heavy step forward, closing the distance between us. He tried to use his height and his broad shoulders to physically intimidate me. He loomed over me with the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged life. He stepped dangerously close, invading my personal space. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sweat on his forehead, making me sick to my stomach. He thought because he was a wealthy white man in a position of supposed power that I would naturally cower before him. He thought his aggressive posture would trigger some kind of submission because he was so used to people backing down when he raised his voice. "You need to leave my property right now," Julian muttered, his voice a low, dangerous threat that was meant only for me. "You are completely out of your mind and you are trespassing. You think anyone here is going to believe a broke single mother over a respected wealth manager? You have absolutely zero proof of whatever crazy conspiracy theory you just cooked up. He leaned in even closer, his face turning red with anger as he looked down his nose at me. "Watch your mouth, sweetheart," he growled. "I own this house. I own this estate. Frankly, I own this entire family, and you are nothing but a pathetic beggar who needs to learn her place." I did not step back. I did not flinch, lower my eyes, or show him a single ounce of the fear he was so desperately craving. I stood my ground, looking up at his red, angry face with a look of absolute boredom. The silence in the backyard was deafening as everyone waited for me to break down crying and run away. Instead, I slowly raised my left arm. I deliberately rolled back the frayed fabric of my cheap, faded cotton shirt sleeve. The bright Atlanta sunlight hit the face of my custom solid gold Cartier watch, throwing a blinding reflection right across Julian's expensive suit jacket. The watch was surrounded by flawless diamonds and was worth $250,000 all on its own. It was a masterpiece of jewelry that Vanessa could only dream of wearing, and it completely shattered the illusion of the broke sister I had been playing all week. Julian's eyes immediately dropped to my wrist. His confident sneer faltered, and his brain completely short-circuited as he tried to calculate how the homeless single mother was wearing a timepiece that cost more than his entire annual salary. All the aggressive air went right out of his chest. I stepped closer to him, invading his space right back, and looked deeply into his panicked blue eyes. I offered him the most chilling smile I had ever given anyone. "You do not own this family, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly steady and crystal clear in the quiet yard. "You do not own this house. In fact, you do not even own your wife's car." Julian stared at me as if I had just started speaking in tongues. His brow furrowed in deep confusion, and he opened his mouth to tell me I was crazy, but the words never had a chance to leave his lips. Right on cue, as if the universe itself was directing this beautiful play, the loud blaring sound of an air horn shattered the quiet atmosphere of the backyard. The heavy grinding of diesel engine brakes echoed through the wealthy neighborhood. Everyone on the patio turned their heads toward the front of the estate. A massive rusted tow truck with flashing yellow lights was aggressively backing up the long paved driveway. It was a loud, dirty mechanical beast that looked completely out of place among the catered tents and the floral arrangements. The driver did not care about the pristine landscaping. The heavy dual tires of the truck rolled right over Vanessa's prize-winning flower beds, crushing the expensive imported orchids she had spent weeks bragging about to the church ladies. Vanessa dropped her glass of champagne. The crystal shattered against the concrete patio, sending expensive bubbly splashing across her designer shoes. But she did not even notice. She was completely paralyzed, staring in sheer horror as the tow truck backed up until its rear bumper was mere inches away from her absolute pride and joy. It was a pristine white Porsche Panamera, parked prominently at the very front of the driveway, so every single guest was forced to admire it when they arrived. Two burly men jumped out of the cab of the tow truck. They were wearing greasy work boots and stained high-visibility vests. They moved with practiced efficiency, completely ignoring the 50 wealthy guests, dressed in their Sunday best, staring at them in shock. One man grabbed a heavy metal chain, while the other operated the hydraulic lift on the back of the truck. The loud mechanical whining of the lift lowering to the ground cut through the silence of the party like a chainsaw. "What are you doing?" Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. She finally unfroze and sprinted across the patio, her silk sundress billowing behind her. "Get away from my car! You cannot touch that, it is mine!" The larger of the two repo men did not even bother to look up as he secured a heavy metal hook to the front axle of the beautiful white sports car. The other man pulled a battered clipboard from his vest pocket and checked a piece of paper. "Not according to the bank lady," the man said loudly, his gruff voice carrying easily over the entire yard. "We have a repossession order for a white Porsche Panamera registered to a Mr. Julian Pierce. The account is 4 months delinquent. The bank wants their property back." Vanessa stopped dead in her tracks. Her face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. She spun around and looked wildly at Julian, who was still standing near the pool, looking like he was about to vomit. The entire congregation of First Zion Church was watching this unfold. The people she had spent years looking down upon, the friends she constantly tried to impress, they were all witnessing her ultimate shame. "Julian, do something!" Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the massive house. "Pay them right now, Julian. Do not just stand there, tell them there is a mistake and pay the bill." Julian swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously in his throat. He plastered a fake confident smile on his face and marched across the patio, trying desperately to salvage his shattered reputation. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. "There has obviously been a clerical error, gentlemen," Julian said, using his loud, authoritative wealth manager voice. He pulled out a heavy metal black card and held it out to the repo man with the clipboard. "Run this for the past due balance and the towing fee. Let us get this cleared up so you can be on your way, and we can get back to our celebration." The repo man sighed, looking entirely unimpressed by Julian's expensive suit or his arrogant tone. He pulled a small mobile card reader from his pocket, connected it to his phone, and swiped the heavy metal card. The machine processed for a few agonizing seconds while the entire party held its breath. Then it let out a loud, sharp beep. The screen flashed red. "Declined," the repo man announced loudly. "Got another one, buddy." Julian's fake smile twitched. His hands started to shake as he fumbled with his wallet, pulling out a platinum credit card. He shoved it at the man. "Run it again. It is probably a fraud alert because of the high amount. Just run this one." The repo man swiped the second card. Beep. Red flash. Declined. Julian's face lost all its color. He frantically pulled out a third card, a gold one this time, and shoved it into the reader himself. His hands were trembling so badly he almost dropped the machine. The machine processed. Beep. Declined. "Looks like your plastic is completely maxed out." The repo man chuckled, shaking his head. He signaled to his partner. "Lift it up, Jimmy. We are done here." The hydraulic winch groaned loudly, and the front end of the pristine white Porsche was hoisted into the air. Vanessa let out a guttural scream of absolute despair. She lunged forward, grabbing Julian's arm and shaking him violently. "What is happening?" Vanessa cried, her flawless makeup starting to run as tears of pure humiliation streamed down her face. "Why are your cards declining, Julian? You said we were fine. You said the business was doing great. Do something." But Julian could not do anything. He stood there completely exposed, stripped of all his fake power and wealth in front of the very people he had spent years trying to dominate. The repo men climbed back into the dirty cab of their truck. The engine roared to life, blowing a cloud of dark exhaust smoke over the ruined flower beds. The truck pulled forward, dragging Vanessa's beautiful status symbol down the driveway and out into the street, disappearing around the corner. The silence that fell over the backyard after the truck left was heavy and suffocating. The jazz band did not dare start playing again. The caterers stood perfectly still. Then the whispers started. It began as a low murmur from the church ladies sitting near the catering tents and quickly grew into a loud, buzzing chorus of gossip. Aunt Loretta, who had just spent the last hour praising Julian's financial genius, was now leaning over to Sister Margaret, whispering frantically behind her hand. "Did you see that Aunt Loretta?" Gossiped, her eyes wide with shock. All 3 of his cards declined. 3 of them. And they repossessed her car right in front of everyone. I knew they were living beyond their means. I always said that boy was too flashy for his own good. I thought he was a successful wealth manager. Another church member whispered loudly. "If he cannot even pay his own car note, what is he doing with our church pension funds? We need to call an emergency meeting with the pastor immediately." Vanessa stood in the middle of the crushed flower beds, surrounded by shattered crystal and the fading smell of diesel exhaust. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her public humiliation finally crushed her. Her perfect life was a complete lie, and now every single person in her social circle knew it. The golden child had fallen completely from grace. I stood by the pool watching the entire scene unfold with absolute perfect calm. I did not feel an ounce of pity for her. She had tried to destroy me and my son just a few days ago for her own amusement. She had laughed when she kicked me out into the street. Now she was the one crying in the dirt. The repo men had done their job flawlessly, and the best part was that Vanessa still had no idea that the bank ordering the repossession was currently owned entirely by me. I pulled my frayed sleeve back down over my diamond watch and smiled. The appetizer had been served, but the main course was still waiting. The thick black diesel exhaust from the tow truck slowly dissipated into the humid Atlanta air. But the heavy stench of Vanessa's absolute humiliation lingered over the backyard. The silence was completely suffocating. The 50 wealthy guests who had been drinking champagne and laughing just moments ago were now frozen in place, staring at the empty patch of crushed flowers where the pristine white Porsche used to be. Julian was leaning heavily against the outdoor bar, his face buried in his hands, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. Vanessa was shaking violently. Her chest heaved up and down as she took short, ragged breaths. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. She could not process what had just happened. Her brain completely rejected the reality of her financial ruin being broadcast to her entire social circle. She needed someone to blame. She could not blame Julian because that would mean admitting her perfect marriage was a fraud. She desperately needed a scapegoat to absorb her massive, overwhelming shame. Her wild, manic eyes scanned the ruined patio and landed squarely on me. I was still standing by the edge of the sparkling swimming pool, my arms resting comfortably at my sides, and a look of absolute peaceful satisfaction resting on my face. I was not looking at her with the pity the church ladies were giving her. I was looking at her like she was a bug caught in a trap of her own making. The sight of my calm demeanor completely broke whatever fragile thread of sanity Vanessa had left. She let out a guttural sound of pure rage. She spun around and snatched a large crystal glass filled to the brim with expensive red wine from a nearby cocktail table. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining her hand, but she did not care. She marched toward me with heavy stomping steps, her expensive silk sundress whipping around her legs. "This is your fault!" Vanessa screamed, her voice completely raw and unhinged. "You did this to us, Renee. You brought this bad luck into my home. You cursed us." The church ladies gasped and stepped back, giving Vanessa a wide berth. Uncle Vernon, who had been so loud and confident just 10 minutes ago, slinked away toward the back gate, trying to make himself completely invisible. "You have always been jealous of me," Vanessa shrieked, stopping just 2 feet away from where I stood. "You hated that Mom and Dad loved me more. You hated that I married a successful man while you ended up a pathetic, broke single mother. You put some kind of ghetto hex on us because you are nothing but trash." Without a single second of hesitation, Vanessa pulled her arm back and threw the entire glass of red wine directly at my face. The heavy splash of the dark liquid hitting my skin echoed in the quiet yard. The expensive vintage wine dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes and running down my cheeks. It soaked right through the collar of my faded cotton shirt, leaving a massive dark red stain across my chest. Several people in the crowd cried out in shock at the sheer violence of the act. Aunt Loretta actually dropped her plate of food, the porcelain shattering against the concrete. Vanessa stood there breathing heavily, gripping the empty crystal glass so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She was waiting for me to react. She wanted me to scream and lunge at her. She wanted a physical fight so she could play the victim and have security drag me away. She desperately needed me to act like the crazy, bitter sister she had always told everyone I was. I did not give her a single thing she wanted. I kept my eyes open and my posture completely straight. The red wine dripped from my chin and fell onto the patio stones below. I slowly lifted my right hand and casually wiped the wine from my eyes. I reached over to a nearby serving station, grabbed a crisp white linen napkin, and deliberately dabbed the moisture from my face. I took my time, letting the absolute silence of the crowd amplify Vanessa's unhinged behavior. I looked at the dark red stain on the white cloth, and then I looked back up at my sister. The fiery rage in Vanessa's eyes began to flicker and die, replaced by a creeping, terrifying sense of dread. My lack of anger scared her more than anything else possibly could. "You are completely pathetic, Vanessa. I said, my voice dangerously soft and calm, but carrying perfectly across the silent yard. You blame magic and curses because you are entirely too cowardly to look at the man standing right behind you. You built your entire life on a mountain of lies and stolen money. You thought you could crush me to make yourself feel tall, but all you did was expose how incredibly small you really are. Julian finally looked up from his hands, his eyes wide and panicked. He took a step forward, but he was too terrified to actually intervene. I dropped the stained linen napkin onto the patio, letting it land right next to the heavy metal grill tongs I had discarded earlier. I smoothed out my ruined shirt, acting as if I was simply brushing away a piece of lint. I looked back and forth between my sister and her fraudulent husband. I will see both of you tomorrow morning at Mr. Caldwell's office for the official reading of the will, I announced, ensuring every single guest heard my words. Do not be late. And Julian. The wealth manager flinched when I said his name. I strongly suggest you bring your heart medication. I added a cold, ruthless smile, finally breaking through my neutral expression. Because tomorrow is going to be the absolute worst day of your miserable life. I did not wait for a response. I simply turned my back on the smoldering wreckage of Vanessa's perfect life and walked away. I strolled across the patio, my head held high completely, ignoring the stares and whispers of the congregation. The catering staff stepped aside to let me pass, treating me with a sudden, unspoken respect. The jazz band remained completely silent. I walked down the long, paved driveway, stepping carefully over the deep, muddy tire tracks the repo truck had carved into the pristine lawn. The heavy Georgia heat tried to suffocate me, but all I felt was a cool, refreshing breeze. I reached my dented Honda Civic, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving the Buckhead estate behind me forever. As I drove back toward my penthouse in Midtown, the sticky feeling of the wine drying on my skin did not bother me at all. It felt like a badge of honor. Vanessa had thrown her final childish tantrum. She had played her absolute last card of intimidation, and it had done absolutely nothing to stop the massive avalanche that was currently rushing toward her. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow the banks would open. Tomorrow the legal notices would be officially filed. And tomorrow, the golden child and her perfect husband would sit in a sterile law office and realize that the very sister they had banished to the streets was actually the executioner holding the axe over their necks. I smiled as the massive glass towers of the city came into view. The barbecue was officially over, and it was time to prepare for the final slaughter. Monday morning arrived with a cold gray sky that perfectly matched the sterile and intimidating atmosphere of Mr. Caldwell's upscale law office, located in the heart of downtown Atlanta. I stepped off the private elevator on the 40th floor, feeling completely rested and entirely at peace. I was wearing a simple tailored navy blue suit, nothing overly flashy but cut perfectly to fit my frame. In my right hand, I carried a slim black leather briefcase. It did not look like much from the outside, but inside that case was the absolute financial destruction of my entire family. The waiting area of the law firm was a massive room designed specifically to make ordinary people feel small and insignificant. It featured rich mahogany-paneled walls, thick cream-colored carpets that absorbed every sound, and heavy imported leather armchairs that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and old money. A massive antique grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner of the room, methodically counting down the final agonizing minutes of Vanessa's delusional fantasy. They were already there when I walked through the heavy glass doors. They were sitting together in a tight little cluster, looking exactly like a group of guilty criminals, waiting nervously for their sentencing. The physical contrast between Vanessa and Julian from just 24 hours ago at the barbecue was absolutely staggering. Vanessa was dressed in head-to-toe black Chanel. It was a ridiculous, exaggerated morning outfit, complete with a wide-brimmed black hat and dark, oversized sunglasses that she had not bothered to take off indoors. She looked entirely too theatrical for a simple will reading, but she was desperately trying to project an image of extreme wealth and untouchable status. She was clutching her quilted leather handbag so tightly, sitting rigid on the edge of the leather sofa. The Chanel outfit was undoubtedly purchased on one of Julian's maxed-out fraudulent credit cards just before they were all declined by the repo men. Julian looked completely and utterly destroyed. The arrogant, condescending wealth manager who had paraded around the patio throwing his weight around and talking down to everyone was entirely gone. He was slouched deep into a wingback chair, staring blankly at a complex geometric pattern on the expensive carpet. Deep dark purple bags hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes. He clearly had not slept a single second since the tow truck drove away with his wife's sports car. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, and he was sweating profusely despite the heavy, crisp air conditioning pumping through the office. He knew the walls were finally closing in on his massive financial crimes, but he still had absolutely no idea that the walls belonged to me. Aunt Loretta and Uncle Vernon were sitting on a plush love seat nearby. They had shown up completely uninvited to a private legal meeting simply because their overwhelming greed would not let them stay away from the scent of money. Uncle Vernon looked severely hungover from the expensive bourbon he had guzzled the day before. He kept shifting uncomfortably, pulling at his tight shirt collar and shooting highly anxious glances at Julian. He was desperately waiting for his 10% cut of the stolen mortgage money to clear into his bank account. Aunt Loretta was flipping aggressively through a luxury lifestyle magazine, pretending to be completely unbothered by the heavy tension in the room, but her eyes kept darting nervously toward the heavy wooden doors of the inner office. The moment I walked into the waiting room, the heavy silence became almost unbearable. Vanessa immediately sat up perfectly straight, crossing her legs and lifting her chin in that familiar haughty gesture. She was desperately trying to use her fake confidence to mask the absolute public humiliation she had suffered the day before. She could not stand the fact that I looked so incredibly calm and put together while her own life was actively falling apart at the seams. Vanessa reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a folded piece of glossy paper. She leaned forward, stretching across the space between us, and slid it aggressively across the polished glass coffee table until it stopped right in front of where I was standing. I looked down at the table. It was a cheap, brightly colored promotional flyer for a low-income state-funded nursing home located on the absolute worst side of the city. "I brought this just for you," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and deep-seated malice. "For when you get old and broke. Because today I am taking everything." Mom and Dad always knew I was the only successful one in this family. They knew you could not handle money, and they knew you were a complete failure. "You should keep that flyer, Renee. It is probably the nicest place you will ever be able to afford once we kick you entirely out of our lives." Aunt Loretta let out a short, cruel laugh from behind her magazine, completely endorsing Vanessa's terrible behavior. Julian did not even look up. He just continued to stare at the floor, breathing heavily, completely lost in his own terrifying financial nightmare. I did not get angry. I did not yell or throw the cheap flyer back in her face. I simply reached out and picked up the cold glass of iced lemon water the receptionist had left on the table for the guests. I brought the heavy crystal glass to my lips and took a very slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool water wash over my throat. I looked Vanessa right in the eyes over the rim of the glass. My complete lack of an emotional reaction was driving her absolutely insane. She wanted me to scream at her or start crying so she could feel superior again. She desperately needed me to validate her fading delusion of power and control. "Thank you for your concern, Vanessa," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely unbothered by her childish taunts. "I will be sure to file this right exactly where it belongs." I calmly dropped the glossy flyer directly into the small metal trash can sitting next to the coffee table. "But you really should not worry about my future living arrangements." I continued, placing the glass back onto the table with a soft click. "You have entirely too much to worry about today." Vanessa sneered, opening her mouth to hurl another nasty insult, but the heavy, solid oak doors of the inner office suddenly swung open. Mr. Caldwell stood in the doorway holding a thick manila folder filled with legal documents. He was a tall, distinguished older man with silver hair, a sharp suit, and a completely unreadable professional expression. He had been our family attorney for over 3 decades, and he knew absolutely every dirty secret hidden in my parents' complex financial history. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Caldwell said, his deep authoritative voice demanding immediate silence and respect in the room. "Please come into the main conference room. We have a lot of very important ground to cover this morning, and I would like to get started right away." Vanessa immediately jumped up from her leather chair, aggressively smoothing her black Chanel skirt. She linked her arm forcefully through Julian's and practically dragged her exhausted husband toward the conference room, absolutely desperate to claim her supposed millions and secure her victory. Aunt Loretta and Uncle Vernon scrambled up right behind them, eager to be as close to the reading of the will as legally possible. I stood there for a moment, enjoying the final few seconds of their ignorance. I picked up my slim leather briefcase, feeling the comforting heavy weight of the foreclosure documents and the unredacted financial truths pressing against the palm of my hand. I took one last deep breath of the sterile office air and followed them into the conference room, fully prepared to finally burn their entire fraudulent world to the ground. We walked into the massive conference room and took our seats around a heavy mahogany table that took up almost the entire floor space. Vanessa immediately rushed to claim the chairs closest to Mr. Caldwell, physically pulling Julian down into the seat right next to her. Aunt Loretta and Uncle Vernon squeezed into the chairs right beside them, forming a tight, united front of pure, unfiltered greed. I took a single chair on the exact opposite side of the long table, placing my slim, black leather briefcase gently on the polished wood right in front of me. The physical distance between us felt entirely appropriate for what was about to happen. Mr. Caldwell sat at the head of the table, looking completely unbothered by the heavy tension in the room. He put on his silver reading glasses and carefully broke the thick red wax seal on the large manila envelope. The crisp rustle of the heavy parchment paper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. Julian was bouncing his leg nervously under the table, shaking the heavy wood and making Vanessa's empty coffee cup rattle loudly against its porcelain saucer. He was sweating through his suit, entirely terrified that his financial crimes were about to be exposed. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and began reading the standard legal introductions. He went over my parents' final wishes for their burial arrangements, which had already been carried out earlier that week, and then he moved directly into the distribution of their personal assets. "I will now read the provisions regarding the physical property," Mr. Caldwell announced, his voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "To our eldest daughter, Vanessa, we leave the entirety of our personal heirlooms, including all antique furniture, the family silver collection, and all of my personal jewelry." Vanessa let out a loud, dramatic sigh of total relief. She reached up and touched the vintage pearl necklace she was already wearing, the exact same necklace she had dangled in my face to force me to cook at her barbecue. She looked directly across the table at me, a triumphant sneer twisting her features. She had legally secured her shiny trophies, and she wanted to make absolutely sure I knew I was getting nothing. Mr. Caldwell turned the thick parchment page. Julian's legs started bouncing even faster. This was the exact moment he had committed federal fraud for. This was the specific clause he desperately needed to hear, to believe he was finally safe from the federal government and his massive debt collectors. Regarding the primary residence, Mr. Caldwell continued, slowly adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose. The $4 million estate located in Buckhead, along with all its surrounding property, is left entirely and exclusively to our daughter Vanessa and her husband Julian. The reaction in the room was absolutely explosive. Vanessa actually jumped up out of her heavy leather chair, clapping her perfectly manicured hands together. She let out a loud, high-pitched squeal of pure delight, completely forgetting where she was and the fact that she was supposed to be mourning her dead parents. Julian physically collapsed back into his chair. He let out a massive, trembling breath of absolute relief that echoed across the quiet mahogany table. He closed his eyes and dragged his shaking hands down his pale, sweaty face. In his desperate mind, he had just been entirely saved. He thought the house was now legally his to do with as he pleased. He thought he could use the estate to finalize the extension on his massive debt and keep his fake wealth management firm afloat. He truly believed he had successfully stolen my father's legacy without facing a single consequence. Aunt Loretta threw both of her hands up in the air right there in the sterile law office. "Praise the Lord!" she shouted, her voice booming off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "God always blesses the righteous, and He protects the faithful. I always knew your parents would do the exact right thing, Vanessa. They always knew who truly honored them and who took care of this family." Uncle Vernon was leaning over his chair, whispering excitedly in Julian's ear, his bloodshot eyes practically glowing with intense greed. He was already spending his 10% kickback in his mind, probably planning his next expensive bourbon purchase. Vanessa stopped clapping and slammed both of her hands down flat on the mahogany table. She leaned aggressively across the polished wood, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at my face. "See?" she yelled, her voice ringing with absolute vicious victory. "I told you, Renee. I told you that you were absolutely nothing to this family. Mom and Dad always knew you were completely worthless. They knew you were a massive failure, and they made sure you did not get a single dime of their hard-earned money." I sat perfectly still, looking at her pointed finger without blinking. "You thought you could come to my house and threaten my husband?" Vanessa continued, her voice rising in pitch with every hateful word. "You thought you could embarrass me in front of all my friends at my barbecue with your ridiculous lies? But look at you right now. You are broke, you are homeless, and you have absolutely nothing to show for your pathetic life. I own the estate. I own the heirlooms. I own every single thing in that house." She crossed her arms over her black Chanel jacket, looking down at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Now pack up whatever garbage you have left and get out of this city," Vanessa demanded, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. "I do not ever want to see your pathetic face again. If you ever try to contact us or ask us for money, I will have my lawyers file a restraining order against you so fast it will make your head spin. You are entirely cut off, Renee. You do not exist to us anymore." Julian finally opened his eyes and sat up straight in his leather chair. Some of his fake, arrogant color was starting to return to his pale face. He straightened his expensive tie, cleared his throat, and offered me an incredibly smug, patronizing look. "It is just basic economics," Renee Julian said, trying desperately to sound like the intellectual savior again. "Bad investments yield zero returns. You were a bad investment for your parents, and now the market has finally corrected itself. You should really listen to your sister and move on with your life." I looked around the table at the four of them. They were absolutely drunk on their own perceived power. They were aggressively celebrating a massive victory that did not actually exist. They had climbed all the way to the absolute peak of their delusion, and they were planting their victory flag on a mountain of loose sand. I did not look angry. I did not look sad or defeated. I simply rested my hands on top of my slim leather briefcase and offered them a very soft, patient smile. It was the exact kind of smile a tired mother gives a screaming toddler who is throwing a massive tantrum over a broken toy. I reached out and picked up the crystal glass of water, taking a slow, refreshing sip. I let them enjoy their loud celebration for just a few more seconds. I let Aunt Loretta finish her fake prayers, and I let Uncle Vernon finish violently patting Julian on the back. Mr. Caldwell, however, did not look amused at all. The older attorney simply sat at the head of the table, watching the chaotic display of toxic greed with a look of profound professional distaste. He did not interrupt Vanessa's hateful speech, and he did not ask Aunt Loretta to lower her voice. He simply waited for them to completely run out of breath. Mr. Caldwell finally raised his right hand, holding it up in a universally understood gesture for absolute silence. His heavy gold watch caught the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room, reflecting a sharp beam of light across the mahogany table. "Please sit down, Vanessa," he said, his voice cutting through the thick air of her premature celebration like a freshly sharpened knife. "You are entirely out of order, and the reading of the last will and testament is not yet complete. There are several major stipulations attached to the physical estate that must be entered into the legal record before any assets can be officially transferred." Vanessa froze mid-sentence. Her finger was still pointing directly at my face, but the triumphant fire in her eyes suddenly flickered and died. She looked at Mr. Caldwell and then slowly lowered her hand. She sank back down into her heavy leather chair, the expensive black Chanel fabric wrinkling around her. Aunt Loretta stopped her loud praising, and Uncle Vernon suddenly looked like he wanted to crawl directly under the mahogany table. Julian looked like he was about to physically vomit. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his silver reading glasses and picked up a separate stack of legal documents that had been resting beneath the primary will. These pages were bordered in thick red ink, signaling urgent financial liabilities. He did not look up at Vanessa or Julian. He simply stared at the legally binding text, with the cold detachment of a man who had seen 1,000 greedy families tear themselves apart over money. As the legally appointed executor of this estate, it is my sworn duty to inform the beneficiaries of all outstanding debts attached to the inherited properties. Mr. Caldwell read his voice taking on a cold, mechanical tone. The $4 million Buckhead estate, while legally willed to Vanessa and Julian Pierce, does not come free and clear. Exactly 3 weeks prior to his passing, your father signed a commercial bridge loan agreement using the entirety of the Buckhead estate as collateral. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The heavy antique grandfather clock out in the waiting room could be heard ticking through the thick walls, marking the exact moment Vanessa's perfect life completely shattered. Her jaw went completely slack. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted back and forth between the lawyer and the documents. "My father owned that house outright for 30 years. He paid off the mortgage when I was in middle school." "He did not have a mortgage. He did not have a traditional residential mortgage, Vanessa," Mr. Caldwell corrected, looking at her with a heavy, unblinking gaze. "He signed as the primary guarantor on a corporate debt restructuring plan. The loan was brokered entirely through your husband's wealth management firm. The total outstanding principal balance attached to the deed of the house is exactly $3.5 million. The silence that followed that astronomical number was absolutely deafening. $3.5 million. Vanessa had not just inherited a house. She had just inherited a massive financial black hole, and she knew it. The shiny antique furniture and the vintage pearl necklace she was wearing suddenly felt like cheap plastic toys compared to the crushing weight of that debt. Mr. Caldwell continued reading, completely ignoring the absolute terror spreading across the table. Furthermore, the loan is currently in a state of extreme delinquency. The primary creditor has already filed the preliminary paperwork for a full foreclosure and seizure of the asset. If the $3.5 million balance is not satisfied in full, within the legally allotted timeframe, the bank will seize the Buckhead estate and auction it off to cover Mr. Pierce's corporate liabilities. Vanessa slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Her perfectly made-up face was completely drained of blood, leaving her looking pale and sickly against the stark black of her mourning clothes. The glamorous outfit, the fake confidence, the arrogant cheering, it all completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified woman staring at the man who had just secretly destroyed her entire life. "Julian, what did you do?" Vanessa whispered, her voice shaking violently. "What is he talking about?" "Julian, you told me the business was fine. You told me we were rich and that the firm was expanding." Julian was hyperventilating. His chest was heaving up and down rapidly, and he was pressed so far back into his leather chair he looked like he was trying to merge with the furniture to escape her wrath. He held both of his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. His expensive suit was completely soaked in nervous sweat, making the fabric stick uncomfortably to his skin. "It is fine, Vanessa," he stammered, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the room. "Do not panic. It is completely fine. I already fixed it. The market just took a weird turn last quarter, and I had to leverage some assets temporarily to cover a massive margin call. I only used the house because it was sitting there with dead equity. It was a smart financial move to keep us afloat." "A smart financial move?" Vanessa shrieked, suddenly launching herself out of her chair. She grabbed Julian's heavy suit jacket, violently shaking him back and forth. "You forged my dying father's signature to cover your massive gambling debts, and you put my family house on the line. They repossessed my Porsche yesterday, Julian. My car is gone. And now you are telling me the bank is taking the house too." Aunt Loretta clutched her pearl necklace, her mouth hanging wide open in pure shock. She looked completely horrified that the man she had been praising as a financial genius was actually a desperate criminal. Uncle Vernon looked away, entirely unwilling to make eye contact with anyone, knowing full well he had helped facilitate this exact fraud and was never going to see his 10% kickback. "I told you it is handled!" Julian yelled back aggressively, pushing Vanessa's hands off his jacket. He tried to smooth down his lapels, desperately clinging to the last pathetic shred of his fake authority. "Mr. Caldwell is reading outdated information. The original lender sold the debt last week to a massive private equity firm called Apex Holdings." Julian looked around the room, his chest heaving as he tried to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince Vanessa. "I already contacted the executives at Apex Holdings," Julian declared, puffing out his chest and using his loud, arrogant wealth manager voice again. "They are professionals. They understand the complex market dynamics. I submitted a formal request for a 90-day extension on the loan. I spoke with their corporate office, and they assured me we could work out a restructuring deal. They gave me an extension. Apex Holdings gave me the time I need to liquidate some other assets and clear the debt entirely. We are not losing the house. Vanessa, I saved us." Julian looked directly at Mr. Caldwell, a smug, defiant smile fighting its way through his absolute terror. "You need to check your legal updates, Caldwell," Julian sneered. "The foreclosure is officially paused. Apex Holdings approved my extension on Friday afternoon. I am still the legal owner of that property, and I am still in complete control of my finances." He leaned back in his chair, letting out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He actually believed his own desperate lies. He thought he had successfully manipulated the system one more time, dodging federal prison and absolute bankruptcy by the absolute skin of his teeth. He looked over at me, the familiar, arrogant condescension returning to his blue eyes. He thought he had won. I sat quietly on the opposite side of the mahogany table, my hands folded neatly over my slim black leather briefcase. I listened to his entire pathetic speech. I listened to him loudly declare his victory and brag about his brilliant negotiation skills with the corporate executives at Apex Holdings. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. The trap was completely set. He had walked right into the center of the cage and locked the heavy iron door behind himself. The time for playing the quiet broken sister was officially over. I slowly reached down and placed my hands on the smooth zipper of my slim black leather briefcase. The metallic sound of the zipper opening seemed to echo in the completely silent conference room. Everyone was staring at me. Julian had a smug grin plastered across his sweaty face, expecting me to finally break down and beg for his fake mercy. Vanessa had her arms crossed, waiting for me to stand up and walk out of the room in shame. I reached inside the briefcase and wrapped my fingers around a thick stack of heavy legal documents. These were not just standard printouts. They were officially stamped, notarized, and legally binding records straight from my corporate headquarters. I pulled the massive stack out and tossed it casually onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood made Aunt Loretta jump in her seat. Mr. Caldwell looked at the documents and then looked up at me, a silent understanding finally passing between us. I turned my attention directly to the arrogant wealth manager sitting across from me. "No, Julian," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute authority that they had never heard from me before. "Apex Holdings did not give you an extension." Julian's smug smile froze. His eyes darted from my face to the thick stack of papers on the table. He swallowed hard, trying to process what I had just said, but his brain refused to accept the reality that was rapidly closing in on him. "How do you know what Apex Holdings did?" he stammered, his voice suddenly weak and defensive. "You do not know anything about corporate finance, Renee. You are just a broke single mother." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the edge of the mahogany table. I let my eyes lock onto his, stripping away every single ounce of his fake power. "I know exactly what Apex Holdings did, Julian, because I am the founder and sole chief executive officer of Apex Holdings," I stated, letting the words hang heavily in the cold air of the law office. I am the one who personally authorized the purchase of your toxic debt portfolio last week. I am the executive you begged on the phone for an extension. You owe me $3.5 million, and I am foreclosing on the Buckhead estate today. The absolute silence that followed my words was the most exquisite thing I had ever experienced. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that completely consumed the room. Julian's blue eyes widened to the size of saucers. All the blood violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly reanimated corpse. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. He stared at me, and then he stared at the red stamped documents resting on the table. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the top document toward him. It was the official rejection of his extension request, printed on heavy corporate letterhead. Right there at the bottom of the page in bold black ink was my signature directly above my printed name and the title of Chief Executive Officer. Julian's entire body gave out. He literally collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair, all the muscles in his legs and torso completely failing him. The paper fluttered from his shaking fingers and landed on his lap. He began to hyperventilate, taking short, shallow gasps of air, as the total catastrophic reality of his situation finally crushed him. He was not just bankrupt. He was a criminal. He had forged my dying father's signature on a commercial mortgage document to secure a massive loan, and he had done it all while my father was heavily medicated. That was federal mortgage fraud. He had also transferred church pension funds across state lines to cover his margin calls, which constituted federal wire fraud. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and the only person standing between him and a prison cell was the very woman he had just spent the last 3 days relentlessly mocking and humiliating. Vanessa was shaking so violently, her black Chanel hat nearly fell off her head. She leaned over, trying to read the document that had fallen into Julian's lap. She looked at my signature, and then she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a primal terror. "Renee, what is this?" Vanessa gasped, her voice breaking into a desperate sob. "What did you do? Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you are lying." "I am not the one who lies." "Vanessa," I replied, my voice calm and completely devoid of pity. "Your husband is a thief and a fraud. He stole from our parents while our father was dying in the next room. He stole from the church. He ruined your financial standing, and he used our family home as a gambling chip. And you let him do it because you were too obsessed with playing the rich society wife to actually look at the bank statements." Uncle Vernon suddenly pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He looked like he was about to make a run for the heavy glass doors, but his legs were shaking too much to stand up. He knew that if Julian went down for the mortgage fraud, the investigation would inevitably uncover his involvement and his demand for a 10% kickback. "You cannot do this to us, Renee," Aunt Loretta wailed, burying her face in her hands. "We are your family. You have to forgive the debt. You have to let Vanessa keep the house. You have plenty of money now, you do not need it." I turned my cold gaze toward Aunt Loretta, freezing her fake tears right on her face. "You are not my family, Loretta," I said smoothly. "You made that abundantly clear when you sat on the porch and laughed while Vanessa threw my son out into the street. You made your choice. You chose the wealth you thought Julian had. Now you get to share in his poverty." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat gently, placing his hands over the original will documents. The attorney did not look surprised by my revelation. In fact, there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes as he watched the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to steal his late client's legacy. As the sole creditor holding the entirety of the debt against the estate, Mr. Caldwell stated formally, "Miss Renee Pierce has the absolute legal right to execute the foreclosure immediately. All inheritance transfers regarding the physical property are hereby suspended indefinitely, pending the resolution of this debt." Julian let out a pathetic whining sound, covering his face with both of his hands. He was crying. The arrogant wealth manager who loved to lecture people about pulling themselves up by their bootstraps was now openly weeping in a law office, completely broken and entirely at my mercy. But I was not finished. I had dismantled their financial fraud, but there was still one final piece of the puzzle to put into place. My parents had known about Julian's true nature before they died, and they had made incredibly sure that the golden child and her fraudulent husband would never see the true wealth of our family line. I looked over at Mr. Caldwell and gave him a single nod, signaling him to proceed with the final devastating blow. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat again, cutting through the sound of Julian's pathetic sobbing. He reached into the thick manila envelope one last time and pulled out a separate sealed document. This paper was printed on heavy blue legal stock, indicating it was an irrevocable trust addendum. The heavy antique clock in the waiting room ticked loudly, measuring the final seconds of Vanessa's fading reality. "I must ask for your complete silence," Mr. Caldwell stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "There is one final clause to this last will and testament. It was drafted and signed just 5 days before your father's passing right here in this very office." Vanessa snapped her head up. Her expensive mascara was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, ruining her perfect porcelain makeup. Her eyes grew wide with a sudden, desperate hope. Another clause meant more money. It meant there was still a chance for her to be saved from the massive foreclosure I had just placed on her lap. Uncle Vernon stopped inching toward the heavy glass doors and leaned forward, his extreme greed momentarily overpowering his intense fear of federal prison. "Your parents were elderly, and your father was quite ill." Mr. Caldwell read slowly, making sure every single syllable was perfectly understood by everyone in the room. But they were not fools. In their final weeks, they became fully aware of the unauthorized financial maneuvers being conducted by Julian Pierce. They also witnessed the incredible cruelty Vanessa directed at her younger sister Renee and her young grandson Trey. Vanessa gasped, putting a shaking manicured hand over her mouth. Her parents had known. All those times she thought she was perfectly manipulating them, all those times she whispered toxic poison about me in their ears, they had seen right through her fake smiles. The realization that her parents died knowing she was a monster seemed to physically strike her. Recognizing that the Buckhead estate had been severely compromised, Mr. Caldwell continued, "Your parents took immediate quiet action to protect their true legacy. They instructed my firm to completely liquidate their private stock portfolios, their offshore investments, and the commercial land assets they had held in secret for over 40 years. Aunt Loretta let out a small, greedy squeal. She had always suspected my parents had hidden money, but she never knew the true extent of it." Julian stopped crying and stared at the lawyer, his criminal mind desperately trying to calculate how he could get his hands on this new influx of cash to pay me off and save himself from federal authorities. The total liquidated assets amounted to exactly $15 million in untaxable cash. Mr. Caldwell announced, the massive number hanging in the cold air of the room like a physical weight. Vanessa let out a loud breath of pure joy. $15 million, she cried out, her voice cracking with desperate relief. She turned to Julian, violently shaking his shoulder again. "Do you hear that, Julian? We are saved. $15 million is more than enough to pay off your stupid debt and keep us living the way we absolutely deserve. Mom and Dad saved us." She looked across the mahogany table at me, a twisted, triumphant smirk fighting its way back onto her tear-stained face. "You thought you had me, Renee," she spat, her voice dripping with renewed arrogance and deep malice. "You thought you could trap me with your little foreclosure trick, but Mom and Dad made sure the golden child was protected. They always loved me more. Now give me my money, Mr. Caldwell, so I can pay off this pathetic sister of mine and get her out of my sight forever." Mr. Caldwell did not even blink at her unhinged outburst. He simply adjusted his silver glasses and looked back down at the heavy blue document. "As I was saying, Vanessa," Mr. Caldwell continued, his voice dripping with heavy professional disdain, "the $15 million has been placed directly into an ironclad, irrevocable generation-skipping trust fund." Vanessa's triumphant smile completely vanished. "The sole beneficiary of this $15 million trust is your 8-year-old nephew, Trey." Mr. Caldwell read, his voice booming through the absolutely silent room. Vanessa Pierce and Julian Pierce are explicitly legally barred from accessing, requesting, or benefiting from a single penny of this money. You receive exactly $0 of the liquid wealth. The silence in the room was so incredibly deep, you could hear the blood rushing in Vanessa's ears. Her jaw went completely slack. She stared at the lawyer, unable to comprehend the absolute magnitude of her total defeat. She was getting nothing. Absolutely nothing but a $4 million house that carried a $3.5 million toxic debt which I was foreclosing on today. Her net worth had just officially dropped into the negative millions. But wait! Mr. Caldwell raised his hand, holding up one final page to prevent Vanessa from screaming. There is a designated executor for the trust. Someone who has absolute unchecked discretionary power over how the $15 million is invested and spent. Uncle Vernon swallowed hard, looking physically sick to his stomach. Aunt Loretta started aggressively fanning herself with her luxury magazine, completely overwhelmed by the sheer amount of money she was never going to be allowed to touch. The sole executor of the $15 million trust, Mr. Caldwell concluded. Looking directly at Vanessa's pale face is Renee Pierce. She has absolute power over the money. Her decisions are final and cannot be contested in any court of law in the state of Georgia. I sat perfectly still, watching the absolute beautiful destruction of my sister's entire world unfold in real time. The golden child had finally been completely dethroned. Her entire identity had been built on the pathetic illusion that she was the favorite, that she was the successful one, and that I was nothing but a broken mistake. But in the end, our parents had seen the absolute truth. They had seen her bottomless greed, and they had seen my quiet, silent sacrifice. They had given her the empty shell of a house she so desperately craved, and they had given me the keys to the entire financial kingdom. It is not fair! Vanessa suddenly screamed, slamming both of her fists down onto the heavy mahogany table. The loud bang echoed through the office, causing Mr. Caldwell to flinch slightly. It is a mistake. You read it wrong. They would never give $15 million to her. She is a high school dropout who got pregnant and ruined her life. I am the respectable one. I am the one who belongs in high society. Mr. Caldwell calmly stacked the blue legal documents together and placed them safely back inside the thick manila envelope. There is no mistake, Vanessa, he said, his voice cold and completely final. The documents are completely airtight. Your parents knew exactly what they were doing. They left you the heirlooms and the house just as you constantly demanded. What you do with the massive debt attached to that house is entirely your problem. Julian was completely catatonic. He just sat there staring at the blank wood of the table, realizing that his wife had absolutely no money to save him. The $15 million was sitting right across the table, entirely under my absolute control, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to touch it. He was going to federal prison, and he was going to go there completely broke. I slowly picked up my crystal glass of water and took one final refreshing sip. The cold water tasted infinitely sweeter than the most expensive champagne Vanessa had served at her ruined barbecue. The financial chokehold was now complete. Every single avenue of escape had been systematically dismantled and sealed off forever. I had all the money, I had all the power, and I had all the truth. The absolute silence that followed my final revelation did not last long. It shattered into a million pieces as the pure, unadulterated chaos of my family finally boiled over. The realization that I held all $15 million and the fate of their entire fraudulent existence in my hands completely broke them. Uncle Vernon was the first to completely change his tune. The extreme greed in his bloodshot eyes immediately shifted targets. He practically shoved his chair backward and scrambled around the edge of the mahogany table toward me. His hands held out in a pathetic gesture of fake affection. "Renee?" "Baby girl," Uncle Vernon stammered, his voice trembling with a disgusting amount of false warmth. "I always knew you were the smartest one in the family. I always told your father that you were the one who really understood business. We are family, Renee. You know your Uncle Vernon always had your back, right? Aunt Loretta was right behind him. She threw her luxury magazine onto the floor and rushed forward, clasping her hands tightly together in front of her chest, as if she were praying directly to me. "Oh, Lord, yes, Renee," she cried out, producing instant fake tears that ruined her heavy makeup. "You are so blessed and so highly favored. We were just confused before, baby. Vanessa and Julian lied to us. They manipulated us into turning against you. But we see the truth now. You are the true head of this family." I looked at the two of them standing there begging for a scrap of the wealth they had just spent decades trying to deny me. It was the most pathetic display of human hypocrisy I had ever witnessed. "Stop talking!" I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of a single ounce of emotion. They both froze, their fake smiles twitching nervously. "Do not ever call me baby girl again," I told them, looking directly into their desperate eyes. "You did not have my back, Vernon. You plotted with Julian to steal my father's house for a 10% cut while my father was heavily medicated. And you, Loretta? You sat on the porch eating peach cobbler and laughing while my sister threw my 8-year-old son out onto the street. You ate the barbecue I cooked yesterday and insulted me to your church friends. You do not love me. You love the $15 million sitting in that trust fund." Uncle Vernon opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off immediately. "If either of you ever try to contact me or my son again, I will personally hand the audio recordings of your little patio confession over to the federal investigators." I promised, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are entirely cut off from this family. Get out of my sight before I have security throw you out." Aunt Loretta let out a terrified gasp, backing away from me as if she had just been burned. Uncle Vernon turned pale and practically ran toward the heavy glass doors, dragging Loretta with him. They scrambled out of the conference room, completely abandoning the golden child and her criminal husband. Julian was still sitting in his chair, but as the reality of his impending federal indictment crashed down on him, his legs completely gave out. He slid out of the heavy leather chair and dropped heavily onto his knees, right there on the expensive office rug. The arrogant white wealth manager who had mocked my cheap car and told me to get a job was now groveling at my feet. "Please, Renee," he begged, tears streaming freely down his red, sweaty face. He reached out, trying to grab the hem of my skirt, but I took a deliberate step back, completely disgusted by his presence. "Please do not foreclose on the house. Do not call the federal authorities. I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. I will work for you for the rest of my life to pay off the debt. Just please do not send me to prison. I would not survive in there, Renee. Please show some mercy." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, satisfying emptiness. "You should have thought about mercy when you were draining the retirement funds of elderly church members." "Julian," I replied, staring blankly at his sobbing face. "You should have thought about mercy when you patronized me and handed my son a crumpled $100 bill like we were beggars. You played a very dangerous game and you lost. The federal authorities are already auditing your shell companies. Enjoy the consequences of your own actions." I turned my attention away from him, completely dismissing his existence. I looked across the table at Vanessa. She was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved violently, taking in short, ragged breaths that sounded like she was suffocating. She was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her fingernails were digging into the polished wood. She looked wildly around the room, seeing her aunt and uncle gone, seeing her husband crying on his knees, and seeing the lawyer packing up the documents that sealed her complete financial ruin. Her brain simply could not process the massive paradigm shift. The entire foundation of her narcissistic identity had been entirely ripped away. "This is a lie!" Vanessa suddenly screamed, her voice shattering into a hysterical, ear-piercing shriek. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. "This is all a massive lie. You set us up. You manipulated Mom and Dad. You are nothing but trash, Renee. You are the family mistake. You have always been the mistake, and you will never be better than me." I slowly picked up my slim black leather briefcase. I walked around the edge of the massive mahogany table, my footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. I walked right past the sobbing Julian and stopped directly in front of Vanessa. She was still screaming, but her voice was starting to give out entirely. I leaned in incredibly close to her face. I could smell the stale champagne from yesterday, mixed with her expensive perfume and cold sweat. I am the mistake who now owns everything you have ever touched, Vanessa. I whispered, my voice perfectly steady and absolutely lethal. You have 10 minutes to get your fake Chanel out of my house. Enjoy being homeless. Vanessa's eyes widened to an impossible size. She opened her mouth to scream again, but the sheer overwhelming panic finally short-circuited her nervous system. Her eyes rolled back into her head, showing only the whites. Her knees buckled instantly, and she collapsed straight backward. She hit the floor with a heavy, ungraceful thud, fainting completely cold right there on the expensive office rug. Her black hat tumbled off her head, rolling away toward the corner of the room. The silence that filled the conference room after she hit the floor was absolute perfection. Julian stopped sobbing long enough to stare at his unconscious wife, his mouth hanging open in pure terror. Mr. Caldwell simply sighed, pulling out his cell phone to calmly call for medical assistance. I did not offer to help. I did not feel a single ounce of panic or concern for the woman lying on the floor. I simply adjusted my grip on my leather briefcase and looked down at her motionless body. I stepped right over my unconscious sister. My shoe narrowly missed her expensive manicured hand. I did not look back. I walked straight out of the conference room, leaving the smoldering ashes of my toxic family entirely behind me. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the law firm and stepped into the private elevator. As the doors slid shut, the massive weight of 32 years of generational trauma, emotional abuse, and financial manipulation lifted entirely off my shoulders. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I was finally completely free. The elevator descended rapidly to the ground floor lobby. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped into the bright morning sunlight of Atlanta. Pulled up right to the curb, waiting directly in front of the main entrance, was a sleek, custom black Maybach. My personal driver, Marcus, was standing perfectly upright by the rear passenger door. When he saw me approach, he offered a small, knowing smile and pulled the heavy door open. I slid into the luxurious leather interior of the massive car. Trey was sitting in the back seat, playing quietly on his tablet. When he saw me, he immediately put the screen down and threw his arms around my neck, giving me a massive, warm hug. "Did we win?" Mom Trey asked, looking up at me with his bright, innocent eyes. I wrapped my arms tightly around my son, resting my chin on top of his head. I thought about the $15 million trust fund that would ensure he never had to worry about a single thing for the rest of his life. I thought about the $4 million estate that was currently being foreclosed on and returned to my portfolio. And I thought about the complete and total destruction of the people who had tried to crush us. "Yes, baby." I smiled, squeezing him tightly. "We won everything." The driver closed the heavy door, sealing us inside the quiet luxury of the car. The Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the busy city traffic and carrying us toward our beautiful penthouse and our brilliant new future. The cycle of generational trauma was officially broken. They had tried to bury me, but they did not realize I was the one holding the shovel all along. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your future? Have you ever had to stand up and reclaim your own worth when everyone around you told you that you were nothing? Let me know your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving toxic family dynamics and building the life you truly deserve. Thank you so much for listening, and remember that your true value is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it.